Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to a brand new video on the channel. Inside of today's video, we're going to be looking at a balance change for every single brawler within the game right now, giving you guys my thoughts on what needs to improve or what needs to be nerfed. So before we jump into it, make sure you're using the creator code. That'd be greatly appreciated. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so first off, we're going to be talking about Shelly. So Shelly, starter brawler, you can't really buff her too much because she's a starter brawler and she might be too broken at the lower levels, especially for first time players, and she's only really good against tanks, so she has that niche right there. So you can only really buff her in a few ways. For me, I would just buff her pellet damage per shot to 450 to 475, just because you don't really want to improve it too much. She's really weak at longer ranges, so this might help her in those long range combats. So next up we have Nita. So Nita's in desperate need for a buff. There's multiple ways you can buff her. For me, I'll just plain simply increase her attack damage. So for me, Nita's really easy to kill up close. Loads of people just get really close to her because you're not really scared of the amount of damage that she can produce. I feel like increasing her attack damage to around 1400, so like a 6% attack buff should be sufficient enough to see her a little bit more in the meta. Okay, so next up we have Colt. So Colt is on the weaker side of the meta, only really good on a heist right now, especially in the draft format. So for me, he only needs a slight buff because Colt has a lot of DPS potential. I would only decrease his reload speed a little bit, so from 1.7 seconds it is now to like 1.5, 1.6, and this normally helps Colt become a lot more relevant in the meta. Okay, so next up we have Brawl. So Brawl is one of these tanks that are not really great in the meta right now, only good in heist, and a lot of tanks are suffering. So for me, I'll just simply increase his HP. So they get melted a little bit too quickly right now, so increasing his HP to like around 8,000 should be nice, and especially if you kind of increase the health across a lot of tanks, you might see a little bit more of a tanky meta. So next up is Jessie. So Jessie hasn't received any buffs or nerfs for around a year. The last time she was changed, she got two nerfs, one nerf to her turret health and one nerf to her normal health. Both got decreased from 4,800 to 4,500. So I think just reverting these changes would be a nice step to making Jessie a little bit more viable. Okay, so next up we have Brock. So Brock is a really balanced brawler within the meta. I won't really change anything about him other than the fact when you respawn, and especially when you have the 4th rocket star power, it takes so long to get all 4 rockets. So for me, when you respawn, instead of just reloading one ammo, maybe like a third of his total ammo if you use that star power might be a nice change and make rocket number 4 a little bit better. So next up we have Dynamite. So Dynamite, another brawler that's really struggling, so definitely in need of some sort of buff. So for me, I think it's a little bit obvious because Fidget Spinner isn't really a strong gadget whatsoever, has been awful for such a long time, so another rework could be really good for him. So my rework for Fidget Spinner, I would like there to be a lot more bombs with Fidget Spinner but decrease the damage, but also maybe add like a slowing effect, so like a 0.5 slowing effect. So if you hit an opponent, it allows you to slow them, maybe hit shots a little bit easier, but also just get away from them, because the biggest thing about Dynamite is that it gets countered up close so easy. So just enabling another gadget to kind of escape those tanks might be really nice. So next up we have one of the strongest brawlers in the game in Bo. It's really hard with Bo because he can go from one of the worst brawlers to one of the best, so I don't think it's actually changing his projectile speed at all. I feel like we should keep it the same because he has become one of the stronger brawlers here. Also the damage as well, I won't really nerf either. For me, it would have to be his HP, making it a little bit easier to take him down. I won't nerf it too much, maybe like 300 HP, might seem used a little bit less in the meta. Okay, so next up on the wish list we have Tick. So Tick overall is pretty balanced except for his star powers and his gadgets. By that I mean it's the obvious choice of which star power and gadget you use every single time. So for his star powers, Wallet Oil is so much better, so maybe nerfing this to 2.5 seconds to activate his healing might be a nice sufficient nerf, and then in turn maybe buff his other star power a little bit, just so you at least get a choice as to which star power you might want to opt for. And then the same with the gadgets, right? So his other gadgets shouldn't really be touched, but my Mania feel like it needs a big buff because it's just pretty terrible right now in some shape or form. It should be a little bit easier to hit those shots with that gadget. Okay, next up on the balanced wish list we have 8-bit. So overall he's a pretty balanced brawler, so I won't want to touch him too much, but for me it deserves a little bit of a slight buff. So before, probably like over a year ago now, it did get a change where his super damage got nerfed a little bit. So for me, I'll just buff this ever so slightly, like 5%, and then you might see a little bit of rise in popularity with 8-bit. Okay, next up we have Ems. So the main problem with Ems for me is players that use the speed gear on the Ems and then just peer out a bush and spam 3 pieces of ammo, and because the amount of damage she does, you just get completely melted. So for me, I think just ever so slightly nerfing her damage should allow you to at least survive if you're caught off guard by an Ems, because she's just a super shredder on those grassy maps. Okay, so next up we have Stu. So the Gas Heal star power is by far the better star power for him. So I think slightly nerfing this again to like 350 healing per super might be a sufficient nerf. So the other star power can get used a little bit more. Then also for his gadgets, I feel like there should be a little bit of a rework to his speed zone gadget. So for other turret gadgets, especially like the new Janet one, the bow one, and several other gadgets, especially which you can put behind walls, I feel like it's a little bit too cheesy that it doesn't decay over time. So I'd actually buff the HP to like 1500 and make sure it has a health decay, so it's fairly balanced across the board. Okay, so next up we have El Primo. So El Primo has quickly gone to one of the worst brawlers inside of the game, and you saw in previous metas when he was one of the best brawlers inside of the game, his super charge rate was insanely fast. So I feel like you should reverse this a little bit. So it is now currently at 12 hits to get his super, so just buffing this to 10 hits only might see a little bit more usage in the meta for him. Okay, so next up we have Barley. So Barley has slowly dropped off in the meta and only really strong on certain maps like Super Stadium as a last pick if it's ever played in competitive, but just as time has gone on, it's not really a lot of maps or really the meta for Barley right now. So for me, I would actually increase his HP quite drastically to around 4200 to match other throwers, because right now every other thrower just outshines him in so many different modes. Okay, so next up we have Poco. So Poco is an interesting one. There's a few obvious choices in terms of balances, like completely reworking his other gadget, but for me there's a few main ones that I would like to see. So he isn't a good standalone brawler, so increasing his damage would be a good way to start, and then also maybe even changing his star power Da Capo to baseline, because Screeching solo is never used. Da Capo is used every single time, so it might be nice just to see that as a baseline ability and then get a new star power and see where Poco kind of lies in the meta. Okay, next up we have Rosa. So for me, there is a main problem with Rosa, and that's the star powers. So for her, you're always using the plant life star power. Thorny Gloves isn't really the best, so you can either do one of two things. You can make Plant Life a baseline star power and actually add another star power, so at least got a little bit of competition, or you could remove Thorny Gloves and just implement another star power. I don't really know what you could actually add to Rosa, but I just feel like the disparity between the star powers is really evident. So next up we have Rico. So Rico, a fairly balanced brawler right now. The only thing that I don't like about him is his first gadget. A multi-ball launcher is a really bad gadget. His bouncy castle gadget is by far the better one, so buffing the first gadget a lot by maybe doubling the amount of balls, maybe just changing the patterns a little bit so it's harder to dodge. I just feel like that gadget is completely useless, so I'd like to see a buff to it. So next up we have Daryl. So Daryl is a fairly strong brawler within this meta. There's only one real problem with him, and that's his star powers. So the Steel Hoop star power is by far the better star power for him. Even on Heist, I really don't like rolling reloads, so for me, I would buff rolling reloads so it actually lasts for like 6 or 7 seconds, and then you actually might get a lot of value with it in Heist. Okay, so next up we have Penny. So Penny, don't want to nerf too hard because she's only recently became somewhat usable in the meta, even though she's one of the best brawlers inside of the game. Again, you don't really want to nerf her too much. So for me, I would only slightly change the gadgets. So I feel like you can get so much damage onto the opponent with her gadgets. So maybe just changing it so you deal the same amount of damage to the gadget as enemies do as well, because you only deal 100 damage to it right now would be a nice change. And then also just ever so slightly nerfing her HP. I just feel like she has too much HP for what she's able to do. Okay, so next up on the list we have Carl. So one of the best brawlers in the game right now, but he's pretty healthy whenever Carl is super strong. So I only recommend a small nerf to him, like I did in a previous video where I literally talked about how strong Carl is. He only deserves a small HP nerf in my opinion, just because he gets a lot of value out of his super. Sometimes it can be really frustrating to face off against him as well when he's really aggressive with his gadgets, so nerfing his HP may allow you to pinch him down a little bit easier. So next up on the list we have Jackie. So Jackie, easily one of the worst brawlers inside of the game right now, but she used to be one of the best brawlers in the game when they reworked her super. So for me, I would actually reverse some of the changes which happened beforehand, like she got a decrease in damage, a decrease in HP, so just the one for me right now, because she might catapult herself into one of the better brawlers. So just a HP buff, so similarly to like brawlers like Bull, I feel like she just gets melted too quickly, so increasing some HP allows her just to get closer to enemies a little bit more frequently. And then also her new gadget is really weak right now, so making you rebuild a lot more tiles might allow her to thrive a lot more against those harder counters. So next up we have Piper. So Piper is a really balanced brawler in the meta right now. Nothing really needs to change except for her homemade recipe gadget. I feel like sometimes a little bit too cheesy just to get a tap and then quickly press the gadget and get the kill really easily, so maybe decreasing the range or maybe maybe decreasing how fast it actually travels might allow you to dodge it a little bit easier. Okay, next up we have Pam. So there's a few obvious things to nerf and change with Pam. For me, her second gadget is by far the stronger gadget, Scrap Sucker, so it needs to be nerfed a little bit, maybe to 20% of stealing the enemy's maximum ammo. Might be a nice change because she just hard counters tanks so easily right now, and then in turn also buff her other gadget, because I don't remember the last time I saw that gadget being used. It's pretty useless, right? So also you've got her other star power, Mama's Hug, so you don't really see that whatsoever. So maybe increasing the amount of HP you heal to yourself and allies to like maybe 60 might show it a little bit a lot. Okay, so next up we have Frank. So I really don't know what to change about Frank. He's a super balanced brawler right now. For me, just to follow the other trends of tanks, maybe increasing his HP to like an extra 400, so you can round him up to 12,000. Might be nice for my OCD. Okay, so next up on the list we have BB. So the trend with BB in terms of when she's really strong in a meta or when she's really weak is that her HP gets changed. So for me, you only really need to increase her HP just a little bit. So just like the other tanks what I've recommended, BB just gets melted a little bit too easily. Nothing else really needs to change about her, so increasing her HP just a little bit will make her much stronger. So next up we have B. So B is super balanced brawler again in the meta, but I feel like there's one big issue is with her shield star power. So with that star power, I feel like it's a little bit kind of mechanically wrong, right? I don't feel like it's actually suited for how you play B. So for me, instead of just having the shield when you have a supercharged shot, I'd actually change it so whenever you actually just hit any shot in general, so whether that just be a normal shot or a 3k shot, you get a shield that can obviously help you in your battles. I feel like this might be a nice change for B. Okay, so next up we have Nanny. So Nanny can be really strong in her niche game modes like Heist and Bounty, so I only recommend a small change. So with the damage gear, I believe you don't actually get the extra damage with the Nanny Peep, and as you guys probably know, as the meta's evolved a little bit, the Nanny Peep is a lot harder to hit, especially with so many people using the speed gear. So just making it so it deals that additional damage when you actually finally connect it might be really nice. Okay, so next up we have Edgar. So Edgar, an incredibly hard brawler to balance just because of how strong he is in Showdown, but just how strong he was when first released. You've got to be really careful because he can quickly shred anyone in a 1v1 matchup. So for me, you only really need to change a few things. So one thing that really annoys me about Edgar is, especially since the release of Bonnie, is that he doesn't have his first star power as a baseline trait. So Bonnie, as soon as you jump onto someone, you deal 1,500 damage, which for Edgar, you need to have a star power to have any sort of damage when landing. So just make that star power baseline. That might be a good start to make Edgar somewhat relevant in the meta. Okay, so next up we have Griff. So the main problem with Griff, in my opinion, is that he's so gadget dependent. By that I mean, really in compositions, he's only really used to open up the map with that gadget. So maybe you could actually add another gadget which allows him to thrive a little bit more easier, or you could just change his raw mechanics. So for me, in the open, he's a little bit too easy to dodge, so buffing his unload speed so it's a little bit quicker. Like, I feel like there's a little bit too much delay on his shot, might allow him to actually get a lot more kills in 1v1s, but in turn I feel like this could be really overpowered because the amount of damage he can produce. So just nerfing his damage slightly might make him a little bit more usable in terms of like the buffs and nerfs I mentioned. Okay, so next up we have Grom. So Grom, when released, was easily the best brawler inside of the game, but since they nerfed him mechanically, I feel like he's so underwhelming. Even with his recent damage buff, I feel like he's one of the worst brawlers in the game right now because of how easy he is to get countered up close. But of course, you don't really want him to be able to counter close range brawlers, else you're just going to be going back to square one with him. So for me, the first thing I'll change is his star power. So the speed star power with his super is completely useless. You need to completely rework it. I can't really think of a good idea myself, so maybe put in the comment section below what you'd actually change this to, but it really doesn't suit him because the best thing about Grom is his super. You don't want to hold on to that whatsoever. You just want to throw that out, get as much damage as possible. So changing his star power might be a nice change to him over. Okay, so next up we have one of the best brawlers in the game in Bonnie. She's so incredibly frustrating to face off against right now because she can pretty much win every single matchup because of her other forms. So for me, there's one primary thing I would nerf straight away, and that is Bonnie's super damage upon landing. So as soon as you land on someone, you deal 1500 damage. That is just absolutely insane. There's just no way but for so many brawlers to even react to that. You just shred them so quickly. So nerfing it to around 750 damage might be a nice start, and then also nerfing the HP on both forms, so around 7200 for her first form and around 4200 for her second. Okay, so next up we have Mortis. So brawler you got to be really careful about because he has such a high use rate when it comes down to ladders, so you don't want this brawler to be too toxic. But right now in terms of the competitive meta, he's really lackluster, and that's mainly because of nerfs to his creepy harvest. So maybe just ever so slightly buffing creepy harvest to around 1100 might see a little bit more usage. Okay, next up we have Tara. So Tara within the meta has really slipped off in terms of popularity in Brawl and Gem Grab. You don't really see her at all in competitive right now, so I'd like to see a slight buff to her. Obviously that damage is always like the main point in terms of getting her to one of the most meta brawlers inside of the game, but I'd just like to see a slight buff to her first gadget, just because you don't really see it being used whatsoever. So maybe increasing it by a couple of seconds, you might actually have to decide which gadget you want to use. Okay, so next up we have Jean. So Jean is a fairly balanced brawler in the meta right now, but in the right hands he can be absolutely devastating. For me, it's just really obvious which star power you're going to use. It's going to be magic buffs every single time, so I'd like to see a rework to Spirit Slap. Again, let me know down in the comment section below what you change it to, because it's pretty hard to make a star power which can compete with magic buffs. So next up we have Max. So Max is on the fairly strong side in terms of the meta, but in terms of her stats, I don't think anything is rather overwhelming. So I'd say if you're looking to balance out Max, probably nerf her HP just a little bit, because she offers a lot of value, especially considering she could be really aggressive in the middle. Okay, so next up we have Mr. P. So Mr. P is another hard brawler to balance, just because he can be a super toxic brawler when he is one of the best brawlers inside of a game, but also he can quickly become one of the worst brawlers in the game. So for me, I feel like he's on the weaker side of the meta still, even since his rework. I feel like he should get a bit of an increase in his damage to around 1140. Okay, so next up we have Sprout. So Sprout is a really strong last pick when it comes to Power League, but in terms of ladder, he's a pretty weak brawler, so I won't really say he needs any major changes. He just needs like a slight adjustment, maybe a slight nerf to his HP, so it's a little bit easier to take him down. So next up we have Byron. So Byron has slipped off in the meta due to his recent nerfs, and I feel like he still needs a little bit of a rework in terms of his star powers, because Malaise is by far the better star power to use on him basically. So Malaise should probably be nerfed a little bit to around 60%, taking away the healing from the enemy, and then also buffing the other star power just to around 3 seconds every injection. Next up we have one of the strongest brawlers in the game right now. It is Squeak. So Squeak definitely in need of a nerf to that residue gadget. 10 seconds, incredibly annoying, way too long, covers such a large area, so they need to nerf it 100% to at least 5 seconds. Just crazy how they allow a 10-second slow in the game, but also this might make Squeak a really bad brawler in the meta, just because he mainly relies on his gadget. So probably buffing something like his reload speed just a tiny bit might make him somewhat prevalent in the meta. Okay, so next up we have Spike. So Spike is fairly balanced in the meta right now. There are a few problems like his curveball star power. I don't think it'll ever get nerfed or removed like I want it to, but it'll be nice to see some type of nerf for curveball, because it's just a pretty annoying star power. But you also could just simply buff fertilize, because it's been so underused right now. So just buffing it so you can heal around 900 or 1000 even per second might make it the better star power. So next up we have Crow. So a super obvious nerf right here to his gadget. Slowing toxin gadget, so strong. 5 seconds is definitely far too long, and everyone seems to agree. But the thing is, if you actually nerf this, maybe Crow will become a little bit worse in the meta. So you got to think of another way to kind of buff him to equal things out. Maybe you could just buff his other gadgets so he gets a bit more shield, or you can find other ways to buff him. But I feel like you definitely need to start with a nerf to his gadget. Okay, so next up we have Leon. So I feel like the only change that needs to happen with Leon is that the vision gear cannot scout his invisibility. I just feel like it's a little bit unfair for a brawler like Leon, who completely relies on his super for just a gear to completely hard counter him. So hopefully we might get a fix to that. Next up we have Sandy. So Sandy has been nerfed quite a few times now and has drastically fallen off the meta. Still an okay pick in some game modes, so I don't think Sandy really needs many more nerfs. If anything, again like Leon, the vision gear probably needs a little bit of a rework, because it just counters Sandy quite a fair bit. So next up we have Amber. So Amber, I believe she should only get a small change to her new gadget, because that could be a pretty toxic gadget if they buff it too much, but it's definitely on the weaker side when it comes to it. But also in terms of her overall kit, I just feel like her super should provide a little bit more damage, just because I don't really want to damage her main attack, because whenever her main attack gets an increase in damage, she becomes one of the best brawlers in the game and a little bit too toxic. Okay, so next up we have Meg. So Meg has really dropped to one of the worst brawlers inside of the game, mainly because it takes so long to get her super, but her super is really strong, but I still feel like it's a little bit overrated, especially in her main attack. She doesn't actually deal too much damage other than the swipe, so I feel like she needs a few adjustments which could make her a fairly balanced brawler. So to begin with, her first form, it just takes so long to get her super, but she just deals no damage, so I think increasing the damage to something like 500 per shot, which would be pretty nice. I don't think that'll be too overbearing. And then also in her mech form, I think just per bullet, I think it needs to go up just a tiny bit, something to like 380. So next up we have Gale. So Gale needs one of two nerfs, I believe, or even both, just because he counters tanks a little bit too hard. It's a little bit too frustrating to face off against Gale. So the first one has got to be with his tornado gadget for 10 seconds. It's a little bit too long. Maybe just nerf it to like 9 seconds, 8 seconds. Just offers too much control throughout the map. And then also something needs to be done with his super, because I still feel like even though it got nerfed previously, like 1.2 seconds is still quite a long time to get stunned against a wall. It gives you enough time to build up your super again and kind of stun them again. So either that needs to get nerfed to start power to maybe like 1.1 seconds or 1 second, or the supercharge rate needs to be nerfed. Okay, so next up we have Surge. So Surge is a fairly balanced brawler in the meta right now. He's on the stronger side just because there's a lot of meta brawlers which he counters, like Cole. He always is that type of brawler. So for me, there only needs to be a slight change, because I feel like the shield gadget is a little bit too strong right now. So I feel like the shield should only be something like 70%, because you can tank so much. And then also getting 3 pieces of ammo is just absolutely crazy. Maybe just nerf that to 2 ammo. Next up we have Colette. So mechanically, Colette can only be somewhat relevant in the meta when the brawlers that she counters are strong. So brawlers like Cole, she's pretty strong in the meta because she counters him so hard. So it's kind of hard to balance Colette because she's one of those brawlers, but I feel like it just needs to be a slight change. Maybe give her a little bit of HP just so she can return from her super. The next up we have Lou. So Lou is a brawler that's always near the bottom of the meta. A little bit disappointing, so I'd like to see some nice buffs in the future update for him. So for me, the big one has to be with his main attack mechanic. It's just too hard and too frustrating to connect shots all the time. So there's either a few changes you can go with this one. So you can either make it so per ammo you shoot 4 bullets per ammo, which would be pretty nice. Might be a little bit too much DPS, but it would be nice to see Lou somewhat meta. Or you could buff the unload speed. So sometimes there's a little bit too much delay on his attack and can be hard to change shots. So it would be nice to see this changed a little. Okay, so next up we have Ruff. So I feel like he's a little bit too good against every single matchup in the game right now. So nerfing his super could be a good way to make it so that you don't get that domino effect. Sometimes in games where you can break up the map a lot, get your super to basically all of your teammates, and then it's going to be so difficult for the enemy to kind of push back and do anything. So nerfing the amount like it boosts your teammates up from 20% to 15% could be a nice nerf. Okay, so next up we have Belle. So Belle has always been a top 15, top 10 brawler in the meta. I only feel like she needs a slight nerf to her damage, because overall I feel like she's pretty balanced and has her weaknesses. Okay, so next up we have Buzz. So I feel like Buzz has really dropped off in the meta, one of the worst brawlers in the game right now. So I'd like to see a nice buff to him. So HP wise, I feel like he gets shredded a little bit too easily when you're grappling onto enemies. Of course, you don't want to buff it too much, but I think from 6,300 to 6,800 should be a nice buff. It should allow you to change your grapples a little bit easier. So next up we have Ash. So in the high end of Power League, Ash is so dominant, especially as a last pick. For me, he just has too much HP. It's really hard to take down Ash if he has the speed, if he has all of these different things going for him. It can be incredibly hard, as I said, because he can pretty much two-shot a lot of brawlers, especially his counters. So nerfing that HP will be a nice change. So next up we have Lola. So Lola, the main issue for me has to be her freeze frame gadget. Nerfing the shield to around like 60% or even around 50% should allow you to take down it a little bit easier, because it just takes so much ammo to try and delete that. I know it's only for 4 seconds, but it can just get you so much control. So next up we have Fang. So Fang has only recently been nerfed and is near the middle of the meta, so don't want to buff him too heavily, but giving him an extra HP should allow him to super onto enemies a little bit easier, so we can get that kill. Okay, so next up we have Eve. So Eve is a brawler that got nerfed heavily with the last set of balance changes, but for me, I don't want to see Eve near the meta anytime soon, so it would only slightly buff her HP. I won't really change anything to do with her super because it was so annoying when there was so many hatchlings on the map, so just a slight HP should allow her to stay in the gunfight a little bit longer. So next up we have one of the best brawlers inside of the game in Janet, and I just feel like she's way too strong right now just because of how versatile she is. So the first nerf for her has to be with her HP, just because if you nerf the HP, you might need to double think about what brawlers you're like jumping on, and especially they're going to be able to take down a little bit easier, so that can be one good nerf. And especially just her supercharge rate as well, only 5 hits right now, nerfing that to 6 hits will be a good change. And also her gadget just has too big of a radius, you can just keep plays out of bushes in certain areas too easily. And finally we have the brand new brawler in the meta, Otis. He's really underwhelming right now, so he needs a little bit of love in terms of his DPS. He is getting the brand new star power pretty soon, which will enable him to have 4 shots per ammo, which will increase his DPS a fair bit, but I still feel like he needs a little bit more, just because whenever you super an opponent, it's still pretty hard to finish them off. So either decreasing his reload speed or increasing his damage should allow him to finish off his opponents a little bit easier. Alright guys, it's going to be it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think of all the balance changes in the comment section below. I didn't want to be too drastic with these changes. Some of them are really simplified as well, but there's a lot of brawlers right now that are pretty balanced and I wouldn't want to change too much, and there are some brawlers which I'd really change their gadgets, their star powers. But let me know whether you want me to do like a star power video or a gadget video where I balance both star powers and gadgets for all the brawlers. I think that would be pretty interesting, so let me know whether you want to see that. So yeah, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe guys, and I'll see you guys next time.